The dimly lit bar on the distant planet of Galnor buzzed with alien chatter. Creatures of all shapes and sizes sat at tables made from glistening crystals, exchanging stories in a multitude of languages. It was a typical evening, except for the rowdy group in the far corner. Jaxa, a broad-shouldered alien with iridescent scales, sat among his equally loud friends. They were laughing, knocking back glowing drinks, their tails twitching with each joke they made at the expense of others around them. The noise from their corner was unbearable, and a few patrons, annoyed, approached the bartender. "Can you quiet them down? We're trying to enjoy our evening." An irritated, two-headed alien barked, glaring at Jaxa's group. The bartender, a creature with 4 arms and drooping eyes, sighed and shook his head. "I'd love to, but that's Jaxa, son of Senator Zore. I can't lay a finger on him or his friends." Grumbles rippled through the crowd, but the bartender's explanation silenced any further complaints. No one dared mess with someone of such high political standing. It was then that the door to the bar slid open with a hiss, and a new figure entered. A human male, tall and rugged, with grey in his beard but muscles still visible beneath his worn jacket. His presence caused a ripple in the bar, as humans were a rare sight on this part of the galaxy. Jaxa noticed the human immediately. His eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "So that's one of them?" he muttered to his friends, who stopped laughing long enough to follow his gaze. "I've heard humans were tough," Jaxa said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "but this one looks like he's been through a garbage compactor." Jaxa couldn't resist the urge to mess with the human. The old man sitting at the bar, calmly sipping his drink, didn't look like much to him, certainly not the dangerous creatures he'd heard about in exaggerated stories. His friends chuckled as Jaxa got to his feet, swaying slightly from his drinks. He walked over to the human, towering over him. Jaxa sauntered over with a swagger in his step, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, look what crawled in. A human. He leaned over the bar, practically breathing down the man's neck. "I've heard a lot about your kind, but I didn't expect much. Seems like I was right." "Hey, human," Jaxa drawled. "Is it true what they say about your kind? That you're supposed to be dangerous?" The human gave Jaxa a sideways glance but said nothing. He didn't want trouble, and it showed in the calm way he sipped his drink. He seemed to be ignoring Jaxa's taunts entirely. That only made Jaxa angrier. "What's the matter? Not feeling so tough in a real alien bar?" he jeered. His friends were now hooting and egging him on. The human remained silent, though his fingers tightened slightly around his glass. His body was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Jaxa leaned in closer, voice growing darker. "I thought you humans had some backbone. You're just a disappointment." He slammed his hand on the bar, causing a few patrons to jump. Jaxa stared into the human's eyes, his grin growing wider. He could sense the tension in the air and revelled in it. The more the human remained calm, the more Jaxa wanted to push. "You know," Jaxa sneered, circling the human, "I've heard humans are supposed to be clever, but I don't see anything special. You look like an old relic from a forgotten age." The human remained still, his face unreadable as Jaxa kept his taunts going. The crowd's attention shifted entirely to them now, with quiet murmurs spreading through the bar. "Do you even know where you are, human?" Jaxa continued, laughing, his friends joining in from their table. "This is Galnor, not some dirtball planet where you can pretend to be tough. Here, we don't just talk about strength." He flexed one of his thick arms, the scales on his skin shimmering under the dim lights. The human didn't flinch. He picked up his drink again, taking another slow sip, as if Jaxa wasn't even worth acknowledging. Jaxa's smirk faltered for a moment. He stepped closer, invading the human's space, his voice dripping with venom now. "What's wrong? Nothing to say? Or are you too scared to speak?" The human calmly set his drink down, his movements measured and deliberate. He glanced briefly at Jaxa's towering figure before speaking, his voice low and controlled. "I told you, I'm not here to cause trouble." "Not here to cause trouble?" Jaxa mocked in a high-pitched, exaggerated tone, making his friends laugh harder. "That's rich. Coming from a species known for blowing things up and starting wars. Maybe you're just too old for all that now." He gave the human a hard shove, but the man barely moved, his boots firmly planted on the ground. The bar went silent again, everyone waiting for the human's response. But instead of rising to the bait, the man simply adjusted his jacket and sighed as though dealing with a bratty child. Jaxa's temper flared. He slammed his hand down on the bar, making glasses rattle. "Answer me, human. You think you're too good to talk to me?" Finally, the human sighed and, without turning to face him, spoke in a low, calm voice. "I'm just too old for this shit, kid." Jaxa's temper went sky high. With a sneer, he reached out and slapped the human's drink, knocking it over. The liquid spilled across the bar, dripping down onto the man's lap. The bar went dead silent. Jaxa smirked as the drink spilled across the bar and onto the human's lap. "Oops," he mocked. "Clumsy old man." The human slowly looked down at the spilled drink, then up at Jaxa, meeting his gaze for the first time. Calmly, he wiped his hands and said, "Congratulations, kid. Now you've got my attention." As soon as the words left the human's mouth, Jaxa leaned in with a smirk, ready to say something else, but before he could react, the human's hand shot up. Smack! The sound of the slap echoed through the bar like a gunshot, leaving Jaxa staggering back, his face twisting in shock. He stumbled, clutching his cheek as the world around him spun. For a moment he was frozen, pride shattered, unable to comprehend that he had just been bested by an old human. His friends, witnessing the humiliation, jumped up in outrage. "What the hell was that?" One of them shouted, fury igniting in their eyes. They rushed toward the human, ready to defend their fallen leader, but the man remained composed, as if he were simply dealing with a group of unruly children. With swift, calculated movements, Jack met each of their charges with a single, precise slap. Each alien was sent reeling, crashing back into their seats, dazed and disoriented. The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed throughout the bar, mingling with gasps and murmurs of disbelief from the patrons who had witnessed the chaos unfold. With his enemies dealt with, Jack turned his attention back to his drink, raising it to his lips with a calm nonchalance, as if he had just swatted away a few pesky flies. The atmosphere in the bar had shifted dramatically. As Jaxa, the tension in the bar escalated further. Jaxa was well known on the planet, largely because of his father's high-ranking position. Everyone in the room knew that Senator Zore didn't take lightly to anyone crossing his son. Whispers floated through the crowd. Did he really just hit Jaxa? That human? Is he out of his mind? He'll be lucky if Zore doesn't have him thrown in a cell. Jaxa couldn't believe what had just happened. A human, an old human, had struck him, the son of one of the most powerful politicians on the planet. His friends, too, lay dazed and bruised after being dispatched by the same human's unyielding hand. Seething, Jaxa fumbled for his communicator, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Dad!" he barked into the device, his voice cracking with anger. "He hit me! Some lowly human hit me in front of everyone." Moments later, the door to the bar burst open, and Senator Zore stormed in, his face flushed with fury. He strode toward Jaxa, his eyes ablaze, searching for the one who had dared to touch his son. Who? Who dares lay a hand on my son? I'll have them imprisoned, exiled. But when Zevor's gaze finally landed on Jack Mason, all of his fury evaporated in an instant. His steps faltered and his face paled as recognition settled in. You, Jack Mason?" The bartender, who had been standing quietly cleaning glasses, suddenly froze, his eyes widening. The glass in his hand slipped, shattering on the floor. Did he just say Jack Mason?" the bartender whispered to himself. A heavy silence enveloped the bar, tension thick in the air. The senator's bravado crumbled. "I am so sorry, sir, I had no idea. My son didn't realize who you were. Please forgive him." A murmur rippled through the bar, confusion spreading like wildfire. Jack Mason? Some of the older patrons stiffened in their seats, their eyes widening as they realized the weight of that name. Jaxa, still clutching his cheek, was stunned at his father's reaction. "Yes, him! That's the human! Why are you hesitating? Arrest him!" But Senator Zore stood frozen, eyes wide with fear, his voice barely a whisper. Jack Mason, the hero of the invasion, the man who saved this planet from annihilation. Jaxa stared at his father in disbelief, his rage only intensifying. "What does it matter? You're letting him hit your son." "Me? I'm your blood. How can you just stand there? I don't care who he is." Senator Zore turned to his son, his voice trembling yet trying to remain calm. "Jaxa, you don't understand. Without this man, we wouldn't have a planet to call home. Jack Mason is a legend. He didn't just fight in the invasion. He led the charge that saved us all." Jaxa's eyes narrowed, disbelief and indignation swirling together. "But Dad, he slapped me!" Zivor's face twisted with frustration, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm his son. "Jaxa, you think being my son gives you some sort of immunity, but you don't know what you're dealing with. Jack Mason isn't just some war hero you can dismiss. They named cities after him. Statues of him stand across the planet. You're alive today because of what this man did." The senator's expression grew grave, his eyes darkening with the weight of history. "You have no idea, boy," he growled, stepping closer to his son. "This washed-up soldier faced an alien force that would have obliterated us in a heartbeat. His strategies, his leadership, they were the reason we survived. He's the reason I still have a son to protect. So yes, he had every right to put you in your place." Jaxa stood frozen, the stinging pain in his cheek slowly being replaced by a deeper, more unsettling realization as his father's words sank in. He had been full of arrogant rage just moments ago, demanding justice, certain that his father, the senator, would immediately deal with the human who dared humiliate him. But now his world had shifted, the very foundation of his pride crumbling beneath him. "Jack Mason," his father had said. The name reverberated through Jaxa's mind like an echo, each repetition hammering away at his confidence. Jaxa's eyes widened, disbelief washing over his features. Jack Mason? The name was familiar, but he had never truly understood its weight, its significance, until now. As his father spoke, painting the picture of a hero, a living legend, a man whose bravery had saved their entire planet, Jaxa felt his stomach twist in knots. His once boiling anger cooled into a cold, creeping dread. He glanced sideways at Jack, who was still sitting calmly at the bar, taking slow sips of his drink, as if this entire confrontation was nothing more than an annoying distraction. Jaxa's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He had insulted him. The Jack Mason. A man whose very name was synonymous with victory, power, and unshakable courage. Jaxa's mouth went dry, the arrogance in his eyes replaced by sheer panic. Statues? Cities? He hadn't just picked a fight with some washed-up war veteran, as he'd assumed. He had provoked a living legend, someone whose mere presence commanded respect across entire worlds. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice, but all that came out was a weak "I didn't know." His father's eyes narrowed, a mixture of anger and disappointment etched on his face. "You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. You think being my son gives you the right to behave however you want, but there are forces far greater than my influence, Jaxa. Jack Mason is one of them." Jaxa's hands trembled and he shifted uncomfortably, his tail twitching in nervous agitation. His confidence, once so unshakable, now lay in ruins. He had been so sure of himself, taunting Jack, belittling him. Now he felt small, insignificant, as if the entire weight of his ignorance had just collapsed on top of him. "I didn't mean," Jaxa stammered, but his father cut him off with a sharp glare. "You didn't mean? What did you think was going to happen, Jaxa? You insulted Jack Mason. Do you even realize how many of our people owe their lives to him? I owe my career to him. Our whole existence was on the brink, and if it hadn't been for Mason and his strategies, you wouldn't even be here right now." Jaxa's legs felt weak, his entire body suddenly heavy with the weight of his mistake. His gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet Jack's or his father's eyes. The anger he had clung to evaporated completely, leaving only a hollow sense of humiliation. He had made a fool of himself, and everyone had seen it. His father sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "Jaxa, you should be thanking him for not doing worse. If he'd wanted to, Mason could have broken you in half without a second thought." Jaxa's eyes flicked back to Jack for just a moment. The human hadn't moved from his spot, still sipping his drink, completely indifferent to the drama unfolding around him. That calm, casual demeanor only deepened Jaxa's shame. Jack Mason had dismissed him like he was nothing more than a fly buzzing around his head, not worth even the effort of a second glance. The slap had been a mere reminder, a warning, of who held the real power in that bar. He couldn't bring himself to speak again, couldn't form the words of apology that danced on the edge of his tongue. His father's gaze remained stern, though there was now a glimmer of pity in his eyes. Learn from this, Jaxa. There are people in this galaxy who deserve your respect. Jack Mason is one of them." With that, Senator Zivor turned back to Jack Mason, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Mason, I had no idea you were here. Once again, I apologize deeply for my son's behavior. It won't happen again." The bar patrons watched in awe, seeing a man of power and status brought low by the presence of Jack Mason. Zivor, the mighty senator, was reduced to a pleading father, begging for the forgiveness of a man who had once saved the entire planet. After listening to Zivor's apology, Jack Mason finally looked up, his eyes calm and unflinching. He gave a slight shrug and said, "Just tell your kid to learn some manners." Zivor visibly relaxed, a mix of gratitude and relief washing over him. He nodded earnestly and said, "Thank you, Jack. I'll make sure he learns from this. You have my word." His tone was sincere, and there was a newfound respect in his eyes as he added, "Our people owe you more than we can express." The patrons, now completely in awe, watched as Jaxa and his father slinked out of the bar, their heads hanging in defeat. And when they were gone, the whispers began again, this time not of fear or confusion, but of reverence. That was Jack Mason. I can't believe it. He's real. Not just real, he's still got it. Did you see how easily he handled Jaxa's crew? The story of that night, of the legendary Jack Mason and the son of the senator, would be told and retold in that bar for years to come, growing in the retelling until it too became a part of Jack Mason's larger-than-life legacy. And for those who had witnessed it firsthand, they would always remember the night they shared a drink with a living legend.